Hi, I'm Dr. Richard Pineda, Chair of the Department of Communication at the University of Texas at El Paso. I'm also the Director of the Sam Donaldson Center for Communication Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual Constitution Day for 2020. I know that you're disappointed to not be on campus, and I am equally disappointed to not be able to share our campus with you. But at least today, you have a chance to listen to a number of my colleagues talk about the Constitution and the way that it impacts what they do, and the way that it may impact what you study when you come to the university. Now, you're probably wondering, why is a communication professor talking to us about Constitution Day? Well, the answer is simple. I am a communication scholar who studies political communication. In particular, I'm interested in how politicians use language, the most basic of all of our symbol sets, to be able to connect with potential voters. Through their use of language and language strategies, politicians essentially are trying to get potential voters to do something for them. The most simple of those reactions is to be able to vote for them. But as we move forward, you can see politicians using language and campaign strategy to try to get people to give them money, and ultimately to try to get them to support their political party or their ideological beliefs. The more that we get into the use of technology, the more we see the value of the Constitution in terms of being able to protect people's expression and politicians' ability to be able to connect with audiences by using language that is not only accurate, but also engaging. Now, the thing that I want to talk about today, political advertising, really ties into three simple roles. And you'll see as we talk about these things why, again, we want to have not only rules and protections established through the Constitution, but we want to have a way to be able to gauge whether or not the things that we're being shown are accurate, and if those things are, in fact, guides that we can use to direct our own particular beliefs or opinions. I would say that ads have three roles. The first is to connect a politician to an audience. In some ways, that is just the most basic form of using symbol sets to be able to show that you have a likeness with somebody else. We use this all the time when we have common greetings or when we use vernacular or other code words to make connections with people around us. The second role of ads is that they help build a constituency for a candidate. That is, that they build supporters and they build the information network that exists between a candidate, their beliefs, and those people that might be following along with how a campaign is operating. And the third and final role for campaign and political advertising is to serve as a proxy. In other words, when a candidate themselves cannot show up at your door and talk to you or communicate with you about what they stand for, advertising serves as that proxy. It's a way for you to be able to learn something or know something about the candidate that can connect you to them and can then connect that politician to a broader sense of the world that they are engaging in. Now, there's a really interesting history of political advertising, and I don't want to belabor the point today to try to show you every ad that we've seen, but I want to identify a couple of ads that I think are super significant, especially in terms of how the ads have been used and where those ads have shown up. Political advertising really starts with the era of television. Up until this point, the advertising that was done either through print media or pamphleting or even mailing was fairly limited. The introduction of the television and television-based advertising for all kinds of other products really changed the nature of how political campaigns have operated in that space. It's also meant that contemporary political campaigns over the last 30 to 40 years have spent a tremendous amount of money in having advertisements made and in having advertisements tested before they're released. And this is a whole subset that I won't spend a lot of time talking on, except to suggest to you that the world of political advertising, especially on television and now on multimedia channels such as Facebook or on YouTube, suddenly has shifted so that there is a much more targeted way to reach different populations. In other words, there are ways to reach out to people who are consuming certain kinds of information in a way that wasn't possible before. And I want to talk about that in just a moment. But first, I want to start with a review of a couple of ads, and we'll start with two in particular. The first is a fairly straightforward cartoon-based ad for the Eisenhower presidency, but I want you to see it partly because you can see where we've come in terms of political advertising. So let's take a look at that ad now. So in that example, what you are seeing is a fairly straightforward ad that looks at the relationship between the presidential candidate and the images of not only democracy, but also some of the other images, including caricatures of the candidates that are running. But as far as an advertising gem, it is significant because it is one of the first, and it is relatively happy. It's got a catchy tune. It fits some of the model of advertising that other products were using at that particular moment. And that's one of the reasons that that ad is important, because you can see the use of the jingle, you can see the sort of non-offensive ideas in the way that the ad is presented. And that was important. If you go back, if some of you were fans of Mad Men, the television show, you know that some of those early advertisements were built around the jingle, were built around sort of the catchy images. And that was about the extent of the way that advertising worked. Now, don't think that there wasn't aggressive political advertising. There's certainly some examples of that, and I'm going to show you one in just a moment. But keep in mind that as we talk about political advertising, the tone and the tenor of ads have changed largely based on the way that we can micro-target audiences. And what that means is that as advertisements are produced, the way that those ads are not only constructed, but eventually cut and aired depends largely on the way that people are being tested through focus groups. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But I want to show you an ad, perhaps one of the most famous of political ads, largely because of the nature of what was discussed in the ad. So much so that the ad really was not run with any consistency, and most people saw the ad one time and one time only. And that ad is an ad that's referred to as the Daisy ad during the Johnson presidential campaign. And we'll watch that, and then you can kind of see why the images in particular are so startling. Now, it may not seem so shocking to you now, but you have to remember at the time that the ad was run and the nature of the conversation of the ad was something that was in fact hypersensitive. So let's take a look at that Daisy ad.
Mistakes to make a world in which all of God's children can live or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
Now, in that particular case, the ad was controversial for a number of reasons. The first was that the image of a child used in that particular context shocked a number of people. But then the theme of the ad is even more shocking, which is that it's about nuclear holocaust, and the countdown from her picking the flower leaves into the nuclear countdown, or the launch countdown, was something that was really shocking. You also have to remember that at that particular moment, the threat of the Cold War was pretty substantial potential for audiences, and the idea that they were doing drills in case of a nuclear attack, and the fact that this was a constant source of conversation both in the news and in current events meant that this ad was particularly powerful in the emphasis over choices in the presidency. And political advertisements, as I indicated at the very beginning, really are about this idea of trying to build a certain kind of message and connect with a certain kind of audience as a result of that. And I think that you can see that really, really well in that particular advertisement. From a constitutional perspective, the idea that this language is protected is important, and politicians have often wrapped themselves in the idea that the First Amendment protects them and their ability to be able to make speech for their position and to be able to use language and concepts that are appealing to a particular set of beliefs. Now, we use some of the same standards for political advertising and assessing whether or not those ads are true or if those ads are dangerous, and there have been legal challenges to the way that political advertising works. Some of that I think is interesting. If you take a constitutional law class at some point, you'll have a chance to study some of the case law and some of the shifts that have been used in terms of advertising. We know, for example, the use of super PAC money that doesn't necessarily have to be disclosed and laid out, has started to increase over the last several years. But there are some moves in terms of political advertising that emphasize the notion of positive messages, or messages that may resonate for a different reason. We're going to watch one of those ads now. This is an ad that is referred to as the Morning in America ad, run by the Reagan campaign.
It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history. With interest rates at about half the record highs of 1980, nearly 2,000 families today will buy new homes, more than at any time in the past 4 years. This afternoon, 6,500 young men and women will be married. And with inflation at less than half of what it was just 4 years ago, they can look forward with confidence to the future. It's morning again in America. And under the leadership of President Reagan, our country is prouder and stronger and better. Why would we ever want to return to where we were less than 4 short years ago?
Now, the Morning in America ad, and sorry for the quality of the ad, a little bit older, but the Morning in America ad was significant because it used a theme that was very popular in the Reagan administration, which is, are you better now than you were 4 years ago? And that was an important part of connecting to a broader audience, and also using that theme as a proxy to be able to make that point to the variety of potential voters. And it is a positive message in a way that maybe the Daisy ad is a contrast to those kinds of themes. Of course, it's always easy to point to the attack ads as the point where we test the constitutional protection of ads, and especially because I think those ads sometimes reveal not only the approach the campaign has taken, but they also give us some insight to the way that people feel at a specific moment in history. And I'll show you an example of an ad that fits that mode. And this was an ad that was run against Michael Dukakis. And so in this political race in the 80s, there was a lot in terms of how people were thinking about threats from the Soviet Union in the Cold War. So it's different than the Daisy ad in the sense that the Daisy ad was far more aggressive in terms of fear, but you can almost see how this advertisement takes some of those elements and then mixes in elements of caricature or making fun of a candidate. In this particular case, this image, which is perhaps one of the most famous of that particular presidential campaign, is something that stuck with voters quite a bit. So let's take a look at that advertisement.
Michael Dukakis has opposed virtually every defense system we developed. He opposed new aircraft carriers. He opposed anti-satellite weapons. He opposed 4 missile systems, including the Pershing II missile deployment. Dukakis Dukakis opposed the stealth bomb and a ground emergency warning system against nuclear attack. He even criticized our rescue mission to Grenada and our strike on Libya. And now he wants to be our commander-in-chief. America can't afford that risk.
So in this particular case, the advertisement is significant because of the way in which it portrays Dukakis. And this was a poorly timed campaign visit to a tank factory where the presidential candidate was talking about the defense industry and was in fact talking about how the defense industry in the United States was going to be an important part of...
It was a manifestly ridiculous thing.
Sorry, a little bit of audio bleed over. That particular incident was ultimately was famous in the campaign process because the image of Dukakis in the sort of giant helmet and riding into the tank was used as a fairly effective caricature of the candidate. Now, here's the important thing about political advertising. These ads do not make or break a campaign in the sense that that ad wasn't the reason that Michael Dukakis lost the presidency. However, there are a number of ways in which themes get picked up by a campaign and get put into advertising that ultimately does undermine some of the way that a campaign is connecting with its audience. And remember, when we talk about that first point of political advertising, that it's an attempt to connect with an audience, it's significant that these ads might create difference between an audience and a candidate. In other words, a campaign can use an ad as a way to wedge between themselves and the potential voters for a group. And there have been some other examples. We're going to jump a little bit ahead to contemporary politics and look at what has happened in the last several decades when it comes to political ads. And in particular, another ad that was based on images that a campaign had actually released in an attempt to kind of show how cool they were or how connected they were. And that's an ad that's called a flip-flop ad that was run about the John Kerry presidential campaign. So let's take a look at that one now.
I'm George W. Bush, and I approve this message.
In which direction John Kerry lead? Kerry voted for the Iraq War, opposed it, supported it, and now opposes it again. He bragged about voting for the $87 billion to support our troops before he voted against it. He voted for education reform and now opposes it. He claims he's against increasing Medicare premiums, but voted 5 times to do so. John Kerry, whichever way the wind blows.
Now, the interesting story about that particular ad was that the Kerry campaign had released those images of Kerry windsurfing. And the whole idea was to try to build this resonance with an audience to say, look at our guy, he's cool, he's engaged, he does all of these, sort of adventure sports. And in their debrief afterwards, the Bush campaign said, this was a perfect opportunity given to us without very little manipulation. All they had to do is switch the image over and over again, but it was an image that was actually released by the Kerry campaign. And this is something that's interesting about political advertising. And again, this notion of how we think about protected speech. Politicians are different in some sense in that you cannot necessarily make the claims about slander or libel that exist if somebody wrote an advertisement about one of you just because they wanted to come at you. So politicians don't have the same kind of protection. The Constitution has said that there's certain people, because of their public figure status, that are allowed to be in the public space. The interpretation of the Constitution, to be clear, not a specific line of the Constitution. But that is important because when we look at political ads, sometimes those ads are on the razor's edge of making those distinctions, but they're significant partly because of the nature of the way that the advertisement comes out. And again, as I mentioned before, it speaks to a particular sensibility at a given moment in the country. One last ad that I want to show, and then I'll wrap up my presentation, is an ad that was run after September 11th. And if you look at the study of politics and political communication, there are certain moments in the history of the United States where major events really change not only the political process, but the way that people think about politics and the way that people are willing to engage in political discussions. And the moment after September 11th was a good example of where that happened, of where the the relationship between the government and the people changed to a certain extent because of people's fears after the attacks. In some ways, 9/11 propelled George W. Bush's reelection in a very specific way because he was able to, at that point in the campaign, pivot back and say, look at what I did and look at how I handled this particular crisis. And depending on your political perspective and depending on your understanding of history, to a certain extent, 9/11 became a pivotal issue, not only in terms of the track record of the then sitting president, but also in a way that was used to leverage against other candidates who were going to challenge the president for the White House. And I want to show this ad. It's referred to as the Wolves ad, and it's fairly short, but I think it's also, you'll understand why it's fairly effective. So let's take a look at that ad.
In an increasingly dangerous world, even after the first terrorist attack on America, John Kerry and the liberals in Congress voted to slash America's intelligence operations by $6 billion. Cuts so deep they would have weakened America's defenses. And weakness attracts those who are waiting to do America harm.
Now, this ad tested incredibly well with audiences and resonated with audiences, largely because the fear of September 11th was still in play as that election cycle started. And it's effective in the sense that it uses the wolves as a metaphor for the threat and the idea that there are more than one a wolf in the forest that are attempting to make their attack. And of course, the metaphor is clear that very much like terrorism, that this was something that was going to build up, and you were going to see more and more of these wolves try to attack the United States. September 11th had an impact in terms of the election, in that when people were asked about their vote, they talked about their sense of safety and security during the Bush administration. So clearly this advertisement hit a particular sense in the public about how they felt about the president and how they felt about security. And again, the notion of these advertisements, if you remember what I said at the very beginning, part of that is about connecting, part of that is about building a relationship and building on themes, and then part of it is that they serve as a proxy. So if a candidate themselves can't show up, then these advertisements do the same thing, and they do them effectively. One interesting note about political advertising, and something that you will probably start to see in the next several weeks leading into the November election, you will see a lot of political advertisements that are produced locally for local races. That includes the mayor's race, which will be contested, I think, this year, and for state seats. But you will not traditionally see the same number of presidential advertisements run for the El Paso market, except that because the television stations that are in El Paso also broadcast into southern New Mexico, we actually see a lot more presidential advertisements than most other places in the state of Texas. Republicans know that the state is fairly conservative, and so spending money here is probably unnecessary. Democrats don't want to spend money here because they don't think that they can swing a presidential election on the state of Texas. But New Mexico is very often thought of as a state in play. So you will have a unique insight into this presidential campaign process, because you're going to see a lot of ads run in the El Paso market that are attempting to reach into that southern New Mexico market. So I would definitely urge you to take a look at those advertisements, think about the idea of how those ads are attempting to connect with you or other voters, how they're attempting to build on the thematic relationship or the themes or the ideology of a campaign, and also think about how they serve as a proxy for those individual candidates, how they're using that as a way to enter into your house and try to convince you of what's going on. All of this under the auspices of remembering that the Constitution provides protections for politicians and for advertising with the intent that what it is trying to do is to inform you and to engage you. And if you think that there are challenges to that, or if you think that these advertisements can be too aggressive or can be too polarizing, that's certainly something that you want to think about as you become a voter. What sorts of limits do you want to see put on those kinds of advertisements, if any? Do you think that there needs to be different kinds of of disclosures. For example, the end statement on political campaign ads now that the candidate supports or endorses their own message. Is it important to have protections against unnamed entities like super PACs to provide funding for those campaigns without necessarily telling you who they are or where the money comes from? These are all going to be questions that you face increasingly so as you become voters and as you start to become part of the political process. I think it's something that's incredibly important that you need to think about, and certainly something that you will benefit from studying, especially in settings like this. I hope it's a great Constitution Day. I hope you enjoy the presentations of all of my colleagues. I especially hope that once we get past the pandemic that you will take the opportunity to come up to the Department of Communication. The folks in my program cover a variety of areas, including journalism, advertising, digital media production, and corporate and organizational communication. Everyone is very interested in the changes in the media landscape, and a lot of the work that we do with our students is an attempt to not only train you how to exist in that media landscape, but to understand it as well. And that's something we pride ourselves on. So again, have a great day. Hopefully you have learned a lot, and hopefully you are excited about what some of the things that we're doing here at UTEP. Thanks very much. Have a great day.